Good morning and welcome to a new episode. Today we're talking about the impact of lenses on your photos. This is an advanced episode. This is a bonus episode. I really want to talk to you about how lenses influence your photos because a lot of questions turn around lenses, which lens should I buy, etc. Obviously, as I mentioned, lenses are way more important than the body of the camera, in my opinion, for quality shots. Now, how does exactly focal length impacts your photos? Well, let's make it super simple for you. I don't want to go for an hour about lenses. I want to make it easy for you to understand and remember. First of all, the smaller your focal length is, for example, 7mm, 8, 10, 14, the wider your field of view is going to be. That's what we call the field of view. This is what we call the focal length, 16mm. If you're at 16mm, you're wide. And then if you're at 200mm, you are very tight. This is a very narrow field of view. This is how you're able to zoom in very far into your image. We'll talk about lenses with a long focal length. Okay, so now that's out of the door. Now, what happens? The wider you are on your spectrum of lenses and the more distortion you're going to have in your images, the more you're going to be able to get in your images and most importantly, the further objects are going to appear from what they are. You might have seen mirrors that are completely disformed, like half sphere, and it says objects that may appear closer than they are in the mirror, or sometimes the contrary, depending on the angle of that mirror. It is very important to remember that with wide angles, you feel like objects are much further. And on top of that, you have more depth. It adds more depth into your images. You're able to work better with leading lines to go deeper into an image. I'm overlaying a few examples. And what happens when you're shooting with longer focal length, 85mm, 70, 200, 400, what happens is that you end up with less and less distortion in your images. For example, the side of the buildings on your image don't look curved like on the wide angle, they look very straight, and most importantly, your background looks a lot closer. This is the effect of different perspective with different focal length. When you have a very long lens, your background looks very close. We call it compression, and compression means that it feels like all those elements have been compressed. When you're shooting with a wide angle, it feels like all those elements are very far from each other. And a last little thing to know about it before I tell you the use cases is that with a wide angle, at the same aperture, you're going to have a longer depth of field. Yes, it's going to be deeper in focus, versus when you're at 200mm at the same aperture, you're going to have a very shallow depth of field. Now, the big question is, what do you use what lens for? Well, let's start with the wide lenses. Wide lenses are usually between 14mm and 24mm. This is a 20mm, this is a 16 to 35, so it actually goes medium. I will say that for me, after 24mm, it's not that wide anymore. It's a little bit more tight. We'll talk about that aspect, but wide lenses are amazing for architectural shots when you want to fit a lot in your frame, landscape shots when you're trying to give an ambience of a place, context shots, and also portraits. If you want to do something different, if you want to get very close to people, you actually make the viewer feel like he's being sucked into the action. That's why the GoPro is really an action camera. It has a very wide field of view and it feels like you are in there with the viewer. It always feels very immersive with a wide angle. Now, the second class I will say is like the mid-range lenses, for example, 50mm, or when I'm at 35mm, so between 35 and 50mm, those focal lengths are great in my opinion for shooting details. If you're trying to get a little bit of details at 50mm, it looks great. You can have the objects, a tiny bit of context, and a very nice depth of field, and really focus on that. Next also is 35mm is something that is very good for street photography, and not good, but very appreciated by people simply because it's very natural to the eye. So you're able to frame a subject inside his own element, have a little bit of context with the element, and have the subject without having to be too wide and having too much information into that frame. And at 50mm, you can start doing portraits. Now, let's talk about the portrait kings. We are talking about long lenses, so long focal length, starting at, for example, 70mm what happens is that it does not deform the face of a person as much. As you can see in the example, from very wide to 85mm or more, you will really have a feeling that the face is not distorted and is like you would see it normally. But you can also just do the test. You just get very close to objects, or you look at them from a little bit further. The face of the person will look very different. Now, on top of portraits, those lenses are great when you want to add layers into your images, but layers that are compressed, layers that are very close to each other, and you're able also to isolate the subject, especially if the subject is close to you compared to his background, very easily. So I really love long focal length when I want to have that compression that gives also a feeling of things being very, very tall and very big in the background. They look a lot closer. Here are two examples. So this is the first photo that was shot during the Henge. I shot at 200mm to really have all those layers very close to each other and give that sentiment that the sun is way closer than it is in actuality. But on contrary, here I'm shooting very wide so that I'm able to capture the whole scene with the light spilling from the roof and my subject right there, which is actually myself and my wife. This was a selfie. We wanted really to capture that light and ourselves. We had to shoot wide in order to get that whole ambience. If you had to cut that shot, it wouldn't tell the same story. You wouldn't have the context as to how we're getting into that ray of light, and it wouldn't work as good. Another example here, telephoto lens, and you can try to guess before I show you. Telephoto lens, why is that? Because I get my subject in focus and I get the foreground very blurred out and the background blurs out nicely, but it's compressed so it looks closer. It looks actually like there's action happening, but you're able to isolate your subject very easily. If I had shot that one very wide, actually the subject would be a lot smaller and a little bit more difficult to perceive in that frame, or I would have to change the composition, definitely. That one was shot with a drone, top down, it doesn't apply. But one more up, this one was shot with a phone with the telephoto mode, so it was at around 70mm, and we have a lot of compression again where the back towers look very close to the foreground and everything is kind of really straight, which is something I love when I'm doing those kind of shots. You have layers and a sense of scale in it. It looks awesome in my opinion when you shoot, especially in long streets and long avenues like that with long lenses. All right, I hope that clarified a little bit everything about lenses. Remember, we'll talk about it into a special episode, but lenses are absolutely essential when you're trying to do storytelling, to really encompass everything and go beyond just the basic storytelling with one photo. When you want to do several photos, give context, all that. We'll talk about it, but essential to know what lens to use when and to understand what feeling you will get and your viewer will get from it. All right, I hope that has been helpful. Any question, let me know below.